right, good morning again, and welcome to today's webinar, NSF Gluten-Free for Dietary Supplements. First, let me introduce myself. I'm Marcy Burton. I'm the Business Development Manager for Consumer Values Verified team here with NSF. The Consumer Values Verified team is a division of NSF focused on label claim certification services such as gluten-free, as well as a portfolio of other consumer value-centric programs, whether it's lifestyle, religion, or dietary needs. And these include our non-GMO services, the Non-GMO Project, Certified Plant-Based, and there are some others. I personally have my master's in crop and soil science, and I work closely with the Non-GMO Project, the NSF Gluten-Free program, and Certified Plant-Based, as well as the other label claim programs. I've been with NSF for the last 5 years, with a previous role as a technical reviewer for the team. And today I'm going to get into a little of what I've learned. So we're going to start with just a little overview of the gluten-free market. So according to Mintel, U.S. Gluten-Free Foods Market Report, the U.S. gluten-free market has grown to an estimated $11.6 billion, and it's projected to continue growth exceeding 10% a year. So helping drive this growth are some retailers requiring manufacturers to get third-party certifications for gluten-free claims. Some large retailers have expressed concerns over their liability for selling products labeled as gluten-free without a certification. Now, considering that the supply chains for ingredients like oats and other inherently gluten-free grains can be contaminated with low levels of wheat due to shared transportation and processing equipment, it's a valid concern. And celiac disease is, of course, a serious health condition, so independent certification based on regular product testing for gluten and facility audits is what a lot of consumers are looking for. So we're now looking at 2016 data from a Label Insight consumer study on consumer shopping preferences related to label claims. So you can see some of our top faves: organic, non-GMO, vegan, and then we've also got gluten-free down here in the bottom left there at 14% of consumer preferences. So consumers are looking at product label claims when making purchasing decisions, and with the diverse availability of choice, it's now more important than ever to clearly communicate your brand's values publicly, to add that proof point that you've done the work to confirm that it is gluten-free. And today, certifications play a major role in ensuring brand protection, market access, and consistent service delivery. NSF has worked diligently to build the most technically savvy and highly qualified network of auditors to provide these certification services. Let's get into the details of the requirements. Now, onto the NSF Gluten-Free Certification. It is a product-based verification with components across product integrity and the facility to ensure products consistently meet the definition of gluten-free. The NSF protocol sets the limit of gluten content at 15 parts per million, which meets the FDA ruling of 20 parts per million or less. This program allows for facilities to process both gluten-free certified and non-certified products, as long as there is a robust system in place to avoid contamination and commingling with gluten, which is the basis of the certification program. So some of the gluten-free requirements, I'll do a brief overview and dive into some more specific details. So the main components of the program include product integrity, good manufacturing practices, and finished product testing. So companies must have in place policies and procedures for the handling and storage of incoming raw ingredients. So each ingredient, including packaging materials, must be confirmed to be less than 20 parts per million upon receipt at the facility. For good manufacturing practices, you must have storage and handling procedures, including cleaning and sanitation methods and procedures to prevent commingling and cross-contamination. You'll also submit training procedures that you'll have in place to ensure these protocols are utilized efficiently. And all documentation must be maintained for 5 years. With the NSF Gluten-Free program, there is a requirement for finished product testing. This is an internal testing policy at the facility level, and this is for a minimum test of the first sellable unit of each lot of product for each production line. And this is to confirm less than 15 parts per million for the finished product. So I'll get into a little more detail on these requirements. Now, as I mentioned, for each ingredient that's received at the facility used in the product seeking gluten-free certification, documentation must be submitted to confirm that the gluten levels do not exceed 20 parts per million. For inherently gluten-free products, such as raw fruits and vegetables that have not been processed or handled in the manufacturing processing facility as in diced or cut, those do not need to have documentation to confirm gluten-free if they're inherently gluten-free. And there are some high-risk ingredients. So per the NSF protocol, high-risk ingredients include oats and cereal grasses such as barley grass, wheatgrass, kamut. If high-risk ingredients are used in your products that are seeking gluten-free certification, each lot of high-risk ingredient must be tested to confirm less than 20 parts per million prior to processing. So if a certified entity seeks to use a high-risk ingredient in an NSF gluten-free certified product, the supplier of the high-risk ingredient or the certified entity must complete gluten-free testing on each lot of the incoming high-risk ingredient prior to processing. And gluten test results will be acceptable as long as the results are not more than 20 parts per million. So another category of high-risk ingredients is our hydrolyzed and fermented foods. So there are currently not any scientifically reliable or validated testing methods to test for the presence of gluten in fermented and hydrolyzed ingredients or finished products that are made from wheat, rye, barley, or hybrids of these grains. So to certify a finished product that contains one of these ingredients, the certified company shall submit documentation that the ingredient supplier has complied with the requirements of the NSF protocol that either confirms that the fermentation media does not contain any gluten-containing grains, or that if the fermentation media does contain gluten-containing grains, that there is a multi-step process including degradation and consumption of protein cells during cell growth, a purification step, and a filtration step. So there is a gluten-free compliance affidavit that will be required for fermented and hydrolyzed foods, and that has to be signed by the ingredient manufacturer in order to demonstrate compliance for these types of products. So now let me move on to a little more of the good manufacturing practices to ensure that the integrity of the products is maintained throughout the full process. So the gluten-free integrity must be ensured by these methods. So you have to have documentation to confirm the gluten-free integrity of all ingredients or the final products that are sourced for packaging. Commingling and cross-contamination prevention of ingredients and finished products from receiving, packaging, storage, and final distribution. You have prevention practices in place for commingling and cross-contamination of packaging materials as well as storage containers. And then there's also methods for evaluating cross-contact where identified, as in shared lines, using swab testing, or clean-out procedures. So let's get back to the finished product testing. So an internal testing plan must be in place at the facility to test the first sellable unit of each production line per lot of product. So finished products are compliant if gluten is no more than 15 parts per million. So acceptable gluten testing kits for performing this internal testing need to be AOAC validated, and I've listed a few of those test kits here. This is just a limited list, and as long as the test is AOAC validated and is applicable to your product type, it can be accepted for the internal testing protocol. So these are strip tests that can be done in-house, and the plan and testing frequency will depend on the lot and production lines. So if the selected product that you've tested is found to have a gluten level between 15 parts and 20 parts per million, you may choose to test additional samples from that same lot and take the average. Now this is dependent upon the approval by NSF, your corrective action plan. But if the average gluten level is no more than 15 parts per million, then that selected lot can still be considered to be in compliance. If after testing the lot is still between 15 and 20 parts per million, you will have to notify NSF of the failure within 48 hours, and all products are placed on hold until they're released in writing by NSF. And what we'll review at that time is a corrective action plan based on a risk and cause analysis. So the FDA's definition of gluten-free is less than 20 parts per million, and given the globalization of the food supply chain and 15 parts per million gluten-free limits set forth by other countries, it is possible for a certified entity to source gluten-free ingredients and through no fault of their own produce a test that exceeds 15 parts per million, but is less than 20 parts per million. And so in these instances, a root cause analysis must be conducted to clearly indicate the source of the elevated levels of gluten, and then continue to closely monitor the compliance of those ingredients. So this process will need to be captured in a gluten-free compliance plan and corrective action plan that's submitted to NSF prior to the release of those products. If the selected product is found to have a gluten level greater than 20 parts per million, then the entire lot shall be found non-compliant. And then the certified entity must notify NSF within 48 hours and must follow their disposition and recall plans. So an annual audit is required. So our auditors will come to the facility to ensure that what has been submitted on paper is occurring at the facility. So the products that are seeking certification must be running on the day of the audit, and our NSF auditor will pull a sample from each family of products and send to the NSF labs to confirm that the product does test less than 15 parts per million. As you can see, I said a family of products. So if you're making a line of products that have similar processes and similar ingredients, then one sample will be selected from that family of products. It is important to note that the auditor does not make the audit decision. Rather, they note the observations and they report back to NSF, and it is the NSF Gluten-Free's technical review team that will issue any corrective actions if needed. So here's just a little overview of the process with NSF. So to get started, we would submit an application that includes the formulas for the products or the recipes, the raw ingredient documentation, labels, and then the compliance plan for the facility, as well as all related protocols and procedures, including the final testing protocol. We'll then schedule the on-site audit, and that's when the auditor will come to the facility and review your systems in place. If there are any corrective actions that are found, those will be responded to prior to issuing that certificate. An added benefit with utilizing NSF, and for a lot of our current dietary supplements clients, this gluten-free audit can be bundled with other NSF services. So if a dually trained auditor is available, they can do the audit at the same time, or if it takes 2 auditors, then they can do them consecutively. So it typically adds an additional half day to an existing audit. So now we have a bit of time just to go over a few examples of some product formulations and really just to walk through the ingredient documentation. So for the facility requirements, there's not one right way to do it. Again, you just must have a system that eliminates the risk and contamination and commingling of gluten compounds. So let's say we have our practices in place for traceability, storage, segregation, clean out, sanitation, and our final product testing plan. So when we look at our first product, we've got Al's alfalfa grass powder. So alfalfa powder, although a grass, is classified as low risk for the gluten-free protocol. And so for the ingredient documentation, we've submitted an allergen affidavit from that ingredient supplier that confirms it's less than 20 parts per million gluten. So one key component about submitting documentation for each ingredient, although it could be alfalfa powder, our review team checks to ensure there aren't any high-risk sub-ingredients. So for this example, the alfalfa powder that was received at the facility has a carrier of wheat maltodextrin. So in this case, wheat contains gluten, so this would not be compliant for the gluten-free certification. Now, as I mentioned, barley grass is high risk, so our barley grass powder, we would submit a gluten-free test report for that incoming barley grass to confirm that there's been testing on that barley grass, that it is less than 20 parts per million as received at the facility. So if this is a 100% barley grass powder and you need to test less than 15 parts per million for the final product, then this test report is going to need to comply with that as well if no other ingredients are added. And then we have Burton's Burn Booster. So this is a probiotic blend, and for each of the probiotic blends, since it is a fermented or microbial product, they will look at the fermentation or growth media. So we'll have an NSF gluten-free compliance affidavit for each of those probiotics to confirm that the growth media did not contain any gluten or wheat sources, or if it did, we'll evaluate the practices in place for filtration. And that brings us to the end of the Express webinar. So we went through a lot of the details there, and the slides will be sent out to all participants that have shared their email. But I do have some time for questions right now. If you have a question, you can utilize the chat box in the bottom left-hand side. Or if you'd like to contact me with any questions or to get started on the process, it's mburton@nsf.org, and that's me, Marcy. Thank you all for attending, and we will take time for questions.